"Oh my God, you clumsy bitch. This is exactly why your kind doesn't belong here." The words, sharp and venomous, sliced through the refined chatter of the charity gala. They were hurled by a woman whose silver hair was sculpted into a perfect helmet. A woman whose diamonds dripped from her ears and neck like frozen tears. She was screaming, her face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing, at a black woman in a simple but exquisitely cut gown who had just been shoved to the floor. The grand ballroom, a sea of glittering chandeliers and marble columns, erupted in a symphony of cruel laughter. Wealthy, powerful people, draped in designer fabrics and $1,000 smiles, pivoted as one. Phones, like sleek black predators, rose from their hands to capture the night's unexpected blood sport. This, they thought, was entertainment. The silver-haired woman, Eleanor Van Croft, the matriarch of a dynasty, shrieked across the cavernous space, her voice a weapon dipped in disgust. "You're nothing, you hear me? Absolutely nothing. You don't deserve to breathe the same rarefied air as the decent people in this room. Security! For the love of God, get this disaster out of here before she breaks something of actual value." A man nearby, dripping in old money and arrogance, added, "People like her always find a way to cause trouble." Before a single security guard could react, before the black woman could even process the assault, she was on the floor, the deep crimson of a spilled Bordeaux soaking into her white dress like a fresh wound. But as she began to rise, slowly, deliberately, something in the atmosphere of that gilded room began to shift. The temperature seemed to drop. The laughter faltered. Wine dripped from the hem of her gown onto the gleaming marble, each drop landing with a soft patter that echoed in the growing, ominous silence. Her phone was clutched in her hand, but it was her eyes that held the room captive. They held something that should have sent a wave of primal fear through every soul in that ballroom. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was the cold, calculating determination of a force of nature about to correct a massive imbalance in the universe. But Eleanor Van Croft, blinded by her own privilege, wasn't finished. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow carried across the now hushing room with perfect, chilling clarity. "You are wretched," she hissed. "You are worthless. And you will never, ever be anything more than what you are right now. A pathetic, clumsy stain on my floor. Nothing." The woman on the floor was now fully standing. She straightened her stained gown with a poise and dignity that seemed utterly impossible given the brutal humiliation she had just endured. Her gaze swept across the room, locking eyes with face after face, some still smirking, some recording. All of them united in their conviction that they were witnessing the well-deserved shaming of someone who simply did not matter. They had no earthly idea what was coming. They had no clue who she truly was. She raised her phone, her fingers moving with practiced grace across the screen, and in that pregnant moment, you could almost feel the fabric of reality holding its breath, because what this woman was about to do would not only shock every single person in that room, it would utterly and completely decimate their entire world. If you believe that every human being deserves to be treated with respect, no matter the color of their skin or the contents of their wallet, smash that subscribe button right now, type dignity in the comments, and tell us what city you're watching from. Because what happens next is going to redefine the meaning of the word consequences. This family has no idea who they just messed with. This was Alani Washington's breaking point. But to understand the sheer, devastating magnitude of the response she was about to unleash, you need to understand who Alani really was. And trust me, the Van Croft family was about to receive the most expensive education of their lives, an education paid for not with money, but with everything they had ever known, everything they had ever been, and everything they had ever hoped to be. Alani Washington was not just some woman who had wandered into a party where she wasn't wanted. At 48 years old, she was a ghost in the machine of American capitalism. A titan of industry so private, so averse to the limelight, that almost no one knew her face. She was the founder, CEO, and sole owner of Apex Stratos, a global conglomerate worth over $62 billion. Her journey to that pinnacle had been anything but easy. It was a saga forged in the fires of poverty and prejudice. Over the past 25 years, she had built Apex Stratos from a single audacious idea hatched in a tiny apartment into a sprawling empire with tentacles in next-generation technology, sustainable real estate, and ethical manufacturing. She owned skyscrapers in every major metropolis, held controlling interests in Fortune 500 companies across the globe, and employed over 250,000 people. But she never, ever forgot where she came from. She never forgot the calloused hands of her grandmother, who had worked 3 jobs, scrubbing the floors of houses just like this one, to put food on the table and ensure Alani got the education she herself was denied. Every move Alani made was a silent tribute to that woman's sacrifice. Now, let's talk about the family that had just so spectacularly lit their own funeral pyre. The Van Crofts. On the surface, they were the very embodiment of old money Chicago, a legacy built on steel and railroads a century ago. But beneath the polished veneer of generational wealth, they were drowning in a sea of red ink and quiet desperation. Harrison Van Croft, the 65-year-old patriarch, had inherited his father's vast real estate empire and had spent the last 3 decades desperately trying not to run it into the ground. A series of catastrophic investments, a crippling gambling addiction hidden from his family, and a stubborn refusal to adapt to a changing market had hollowed out the company's foundations. What absolutely no one in that ballroom knew, not his wife, not his children, not even his most trusted advisors, was that Van Croft Enterprises was secretly, terrifyingly bankrupt. The company that had once seemed to own half of Chicago's skyline was now leveraged to the breaking point, a house of cards waiting for the slightest breeze to bring it all down. Harrison had been juggling debts, taking out predatory loans, and praying for a miracle to save not just his business, but his family's very name. His wife, Eleanor, at 61, lived in a carefully constructed bubble of social superiority, which she guarded more ferociously than a dragon guards its hoard. Her entire identity was woven from the threads of being a Van Croft, of being better, richer, and more important than everyone else. The thought of losing her status, her position on charity boards, her ability to look down her nose at others from the rarefied air of the elite, terrified her far more than mere financial ruin. Eleanor organized charity events not from a place of compassion, but from a lust for control. They were her stage, and on that stage, she directed a play where she was the queen, and everyone else was a subject to be favored or cast out. Social exclusion was her favorite weapon, and she wielded it with surgical, cruel precision. Their son, Carter, 29, was a walking, talking catastrophe wrapped in a $10,000 tuxedo. He had never worked a legitimate day in his life, had spectacularly failed at every single vanity business venture his father had bankrolled for him, and spent his nights and fortunes partying with a cohort of equally useless trust fund babies. Carter's entire existence was funded by a legacy he did nothing to build and everything to squander. He had cultivated a particularly nasty strain of cruelty, using it to inflate his own fragile ego by deflating others. And their daughter Blair, at 27, was perhaps the most insidiously dangerous of them all. Blessed with classic beauty, dripping with charm, and possessed of a heart of pure, cold ice, she had learned at her mother's knee that cruelty, when practiced with finesse, was a legitimate art form. Blair derived a genuine, palpable pleasure from humiliating people, especially those she deemed socially inferior. She was Daddy's princess, spoiled to the point of sociopathy, and had never once in her life faced a real consequence for any of her malicious actions. But here is the cosmic, devastating secret that none of them knew as they stood in their palatial penthouse on that snowy December night, laughing at the stained woman on their floor. Alani Washington held their entire existence, their past, their present, and their future, in the palm of her hand. The charity gala they were hosting wasn't just another party. It was meant to be the triumphant celebration of the single biggest business deal in Van Croft history. A monumental $2.5 billion merger with Apex Stratos that would not only erase Harrison's mountain of secret debt, but would also catapult the Van Croft family into a new stratosphere of wealth and power. Harrison had been in excruciatingly delicate negotiations for this deal for nearly a year. It was set to be announced with great fanfare that very evening. This merger was his miracle. It was the cash infusion that would save his company, secure his legacy, and ensure the Van Crofts remained at the pinnacle of society for generations to come. But the woman they had just called worthless, wretched, a disaster, and nothing? She was Alani Washington, the ghost, the titan, the founder and CEO of Apex Stratos. The very woman whose signature was required on the documents that would save their crumbling empire was, at that very moment, wiping their spilled wine off her bruised hands. And the most exquisite, brutal irony of all? Harrison Van Croft had no idea what Alani Washington looked like. All of their negotiations had been conducted through phalanxes of lawyers and intermediaries. He had never seen a photo. Her notorious privacy was legendary. He had never met her in person. In his mind, he was probably picturing some grizzled, old white businessman in a stuffy suit. The Van Crofts had just committed the most expensive act of self-destruction in corporate history. They just didn't know it yet. But the nightmare for Alani Washington didn't begin when her body hit that cold marble floor. It began hours earlier, the moment she stepped out of her unassuming private car and approached the very building she, in fact, owned. It was 6 p.m. on a bitterly cold December night in Chicago. Snowflakes were beginning to drift down, blanketing the city in a soft, white hush. Alani had arrived at the opulent Gold Coast penthouse, looking like a vision of understated elegance. She wore a simple, sleeveless white gown, a custom creation from a designer so exclusive he didn't even have a storefront. Her hair was swept up in a graceful chignon, and her only jewelry was a pair of diamond studs and a delicate bracelet, each piece worth more than the average American home. She carried herself with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a woman who knows she belongs in any room she chooses to enter. This was supposed to be a momentous night for her, too. The night she would finally meet the Van Croft family face to face and toast to their new, historic partnership. She had looked forward to it for weeks, imagining a pleasant evening of mutual respect and celebration. But the moment she stepped toward the building's grand, canopied entrance, reality slapped her across the face with an icy, prejudiced hand. A valet in a thick wool coat rushed over, not to open her car door, but to intercept her. Without even making eye contact, he gestured dismissively toward a dark alley around the back of the building. "Ma'am, service entrance is around back," he said, his tone flat and bored, making it clear he believed her presence at the front was a mistake that needed correcting. Alani paused, a flicker of disbelief crossing her features. "I'm sorry. I'm here for the Van Croft Charity Gala." The valet finally looked at her, his gaze raking over her from head to toe. Confusion warred with suspicion on his face. It was as if the concept of a black woman attending this particular event was a complex equation his brain refused to compute. He reluctantly gestured toward the main entrance with a sigh, but his expression screamed what his mouth didn't say. He was sure she was in the wrong place. At the main entrance, behind a velvet rope and a polished podium, a security guard named Greg was checking invitations. For a few minutes, Alani simply observed, and what she saw was a masterclass in unconscious bias. Guest after guest approached, all of them white, all of them dripping with wealth. Greg would offer a cursory glance at their embossed invitations, flash a warm, welcoming smile, and wave them in with a cheerful, "Good evening, enjoy the party." A white woman in a floor-length fur coat swept past, her invitation barely visible, and Greg all but bowed her through. A boisterous man in a tuxedo, shouting into his phone, waved something that might have been an invitation in Greg's general direction, and the guard practically tripped over himself to open the door for him personally. Then, it was Alani's turn. Everything changed. The moment she presented her invitation, Greg's demeanor shifted from welcoming host to suspicious interrogator. The warm smile vanished, replaced by a tight, professional scowl. He held her invitation as if it might be contaminated, studying it like a detective examining a forgery. He scanned his guest list once, then twice, then a third time, his thick finger tracing the names with agonizing slowness. "I don't see any Washington on this list," he announced, his voice just loud enough for the couple arriving behind her to overhear. "Could you please check again?" Alani asked, her voice a calm, even sea in a growing storm of frustration. "I am definitely expected." Greg made an elaborate pantomime of scrutinizing his list again, squinting under the dim light as if the letters might rearrange themselves. He shook his head slowly, with a theatrical finality. "Nope. No Washington. Sorry." Behind Alani, a white couple rustled their invitation. Greg barely glanced at it before breaking into his widest smile of the evening. "Go right on in, Mr. and Mrs. Albright. Have a wonderful evening," he chirped. Alani felt her stomach clench. "But I have the invitation right here," she said, pointing to the thick, cream-colored cardstock in his hand. The very same type of invitation that had served as an unquestioned passport for dozens of other guests. Greg held up her elegant invitation and shook his head with an air of condescending pity. "Ma'am, anyone can fake these things nowadays. They print 'em out at Kinko's, make 'em look all official. We have to be careful about who we let in." As he spoke, another guest walked past them with an invitation that looked like a simple printout from a home office. Greg waved him through without a second look. "I'm going to need to see some form of identification," Greg told Alani, his hand outstretched, palm up. She produced her driver's license, a valid Illinois state ID. Greg took it and began a forensic examination that would have made a TSA agent proud. He held it up to the light. He angled it back and forth. He compared the photo to her face at least 5 times, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. He even ran his thumb over the surface as if checking for a false laminate. "This doesn't look right to me," he declared, again loud enough for others to hear. "The picture. It doesn't really look like you." The picture looked exactly like her. It was a clear professional photograph taken just months prior. But Greg wasn't truly examining the photo. He was searching for a justification for the prejudice he already felt. "I can assure you, it is completely legitimate," Alani said, her patience stretched to a razor's edge. "We're going to have to verify this with management," Greg announced with an air of grave importance, stepping away with both her invitation and her ID. "You'll have to wait out here while we get this sorted out." And so began the longest 90 minutes of Alani Washington's life. She stood outside in the biting Chicago wind, the snow beginning to stick to the shoulders of her gown, watching as hundreds of guests sailed past her into the warmth and luxury of the penthouse. The temperature was dropping, and her elegant dress offered little protection against the elements. She watched couples laughing as they passed, businessmen she recognized from the cover of Fortune, socialites whose charities her own foundation secretly funded. None of them were asked for ID. None of them were told to wait. None of them were treated like a potential criminal trying to breach the castle walls. Every 15 minutes, Greg would pop his head out with a non-update. "Still checking, ma'am," he'd say with a saccharine, fake sympathy. "Shouldn't be much longer." But through the plate glass doors, Alani could see him perfectly clearly. He wasn't making any calls. He wasn't speaking into his radio. He was chatting with the coat check girl, laughing with the other security guards. He wasn't verifying a single thing. He was engaged in a quiet, brutal power play, hoping she would simply give up and go away. As she waited, she watched the social ballet unfold. A group of rowdy young men, clearly intoxicated, were welcomed with boisterous laughter. An older woman who had forgotten her invitation was allowed in simply because Greg recognized her face. But Alani remained outside, shivering, being made a spectacle for the arriving elite. At one point, a woman in a mink coat passed her and physically pulled her husband away, as if Alani's mere presence were a contagion. Another guest stared at her openly, whispering to his wife about how some people just don't get the message. By the time Greg finally returned with her documents, offering a grudging, tight-lipped admission that she could enter, nearly 2 hours had passed. Alani had missed the entire cocktail reception, the networking hour, and the main dinner service. She was being permitted to enter a celebration in her own honor after it was functionally over. Her feet ached from standing in heels on the frozen pavement. Her meticulously styled hair was now windswept. and the initial flicker of excitement for the evening had been extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard knot of dread. She had no idea the true humiliation had only just begun. The moment Alani stepped into the gleaming marble foyer of the penthouse, the very penthouse that was, unbeknownst to everyone, owned by one of her anonymous real estate holdings, Eleanor Van Croft spotted her from across the room. Eleanor's reaction was instantaneous, visceral, and loud enough for half the party to hear. "Oh my God, how in the world did the cleaning lady get past security?" The words, like a dropped champagne flute, shattered the elegant ambiance. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Heads swiveled, 100 pairs of eyes fixed on Alani, standing alone in the grand entrance. Harrison Van Croft, who had been regaling a circle of potential investors with a well-worn anecdote, stopped speaking and turned to see what his wife was screeching about. When his eyes landed on Alani, his voice boomed with indignant authority. "This is a private event, not a job fair. Security!" Carter Van Croft, already several whiskeys deep, saw his opportunity for a cruel laugh. He raised his glass in a mock toast. "Hey, did someone order maid service?" he yelled to his posse of drunken sycophants. "Because I think the guest bathrooms could use a little attention." His friends roared with laughter, clinking their glasses together as if he had just delivered the wittiest line of the century. Blair Van Croft, who had been posing for a socialite's Instagram story, let out a delicate musical giggle that carried across the room. "She's probably looking for the broom closet," she chimed in. "Someone should really give her directions." More laughter, a ripple effect of shared disdain. Phones were now out in force, not just to record, but to live-tweet the spectacle. Alani opened her mouth to speak, to try and diffuse the situation, to explain the colossal misunderstanding. She had imagined this moment, how she would gracefully introduce herself. "Actually, I'm here for—" But Eleanor Van Croft cut her off, striding closer with the unshakable confidence of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. "Sweetheart," she began, her smile a slash of pure venom, "you are nothing. Do you understand me? Nothing. This is not your world, and it never will be." Eleanor's voice grew louder, more theatrical, as she played to her captive audience. "You are wretched and pathetic, and you do not deserve to breathe the same air as decent people like us." Harrison nodded sagely, shaking his head in performative disgust. "Security has completely failed us tonight. How do people like this keep getting into places where they so obviously do not belong?" Guests began to close in, forming a loose, predatory circle. They whispered and pointed, their comments landing like small, sharp stones. "Look at her, trying to act all sophisticated," one woman sneered. "The absolute nerve of some people," another man added, shaking his head. After her hours-long ordeal outside, Alani was parched. She tried to approach the bar for a simple glass of water, but the bartender's eyes flicked immediately to Eleanor, seeking permission. Eleanor's response was swift and merciless. She shook her head with theatrical violence and called out, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "No drinks for the help! She doesn't deserve even a drop of water from our glasses." Carter found this utterly hilarious. He staggered over, his expensive suit rumpled, and pointed at Alani with his half-empty glass. "Hey, if you really want to make yourself useful," he slurred, "why don't you go find the real staff and help them serve real people? At least then you'd be doing a job you're actually qualified for." Blair clapped her hands in delight, as if her brother had just uttered a profound truth. "Yes, finally a role she might actually be good at." The crowd roared its approval, treating Carter's barbarism like a comedy routine. When Alani tried to find a place to sit, her feet screaming in protest from standing outside for 2 hours, Eleanor physically blocked her path. "Those chairs are for our guests," she said, her eyes raking over Alani with unconcealed revulsion. "Not for whatever you are." So Alani was forced to stand in a corner of the grand ballroom, the subject of an entire party's scorn. She became their living entertainment. Guests would walk by and deliver drive-by insults, just loud enough for her to hear. "Look at how she's trying to pretend she belongs here. The audacity is just breathtaking. Someone should call social services. This is just sad. I cannot believe security let this happen." For what felt like an eternity, Alani endured this systematic, public stripping of her humanity. She stood there, being degraded by people whose entire fortunes, she knew, were teetering on the edge of a cliff. She watched as these people she had been prepared to make partners, people she had been ready to make richer than their wildest dreams, revealed the black rot in their souls. And through it all, she held her composure. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't flee. She just stood there, a silent observer, letting them show her exactly who they were. Finally, she pulled out her phone. It was time. She needed to check the final details of the merger documents, the very documents that were scheduled to be signed and announced that night. The documents that would inject a life-saving $2, $5 billion into the Vancrofts' dying empire. And that's when Blair Vancroft decided it was time for the grand finale. She glided toward Alani, a full glass of deep red Bordeaux in her hand, her face a perfect mask of synthetic sympathy that was worthy of an Oscar. "Oh, I feel just awful for you," she cooed, her voice carrying just enough for the nearby guests to appreciate her apparent magnanimity. "You look so thirsty after your ordeal. Here, please, let me get you something to drink." Alani looked up, a flicker of genuine surprise in her eyes. After hours of unremitting cruelty, could this be a single, solitary act of human kindness? She reached out a grateful hand for the glass, thinking that maybe, just maybe, there was a shred of decency in this family after all. But as her fingers were about to close around the stem of the glass, Blair deliberately, with practiced malice, stuck out her silk-clad leg. Alani, caught off guard, tripped and went down hard, crashing onto the unforgiving marble floor. In the exact same fluid, rehearsed motion, Blair accidentally upended the entire glass of red wine onto Alani's white dress, the crimson liquid blooming across the fabric like a fatal stain. Blair immediately launched into her award-winning performance. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in mock horror, her eyes wide with feigned shock. "Oh my God, you're so clumsy. I am so sorry. I was just trying to help you." Eleanor rushed to the scene, her voice a clarion call of righteous indignation. "This is exactly what I was talking about. This is what happens when these people forget their place. Look at the mess you've made on our floors." Carter was already filming the scene with his phone, laughing so hard he could barely keep it steady. "This is going viral. Somebody call housekeeping. Oh wait, she is housekeeping." The room exploded. The laughter was a physical, concussive force. Phones shot up from every direction. Instagram stories were being created in real time. Tweets were being fired off. This was the pinnacle of their evening, the absolute, total, and complete humiliation of another human being. Harrison waved frantically at the security guards who had finally materialized. "Get this walking disaster out of my home before she destroys something that's actually valuable." And that brings us to the moment where our story began. With Alani Washington on the floor of a penthouse she owned, soaked in wine, surrounded by the braying laughter of people who had just made the single greatest mistake of their lives. They had no idea that the woman they saw as nothing held their everything in her hands. They had no idea she was worth more than their entire guest list combined. They had no idea she owned the building they stood in, the companies that kept them rich, and the future they so arrogantly assumed was secure. But they were about to find out, and it was going to cost them everything. What would you do in that situation? Would you have walked away with your dignity? Or would you have stayed and served up the justice they so richly deserved? Drop your answer in the comments below and hit that subscribe button. Because what this woman does next will cost this entitled family every penny they have ever had. What happened next was the moment that would be seared into the memory of the Vancroft family for the rest of their shattered lives. Alani Washington began to rise from the cold marble floor. She moved slowly, deliberately, not like a victim, but like a queen reclaiming her throne. The red wine dripped from her sullied gown onto the pristine floor, each drop a punctuation mark in a story that was about to take a terrifying turn. But they were still laughing. The room was still high on the adrenaline of its own cruelty. Phones still recording. Guests still cracking jokes at her expense. They thought this was the final act, the moment the help would be ignominiously escorted out so their rarefied evening could continue. They had no idea the main event was just beginning. As Alani stood there, wine-stained but radiating an aura of terrifying calm, her phone began to ring. The sound, a simple, clear chime, sliced through the raucous laughter, but the crowd was too busy celebrating its own barbarism to pay it any mind. Alani glanced at the caller ID and answered with a composure that should have sent a bolt of pure fear down every spine in the room. Apex Stratos, Alani Washington speaking. The voice on the other end was her chief legal counsel, David Chen, crisp, professional, and loud enough for the guests closest to her to overhear, if only they had been listening. Ms. Washington, this is David from legal. The Vancroft merger contracts are finalized and ready for your digital signature. Should I release them for the announcement tonight, as planned? The room was still buzzing. Carter was replaying the video of Alani's fall for a cheering audience. Blair was posing for selfies, making sure the dramatic wine stain on the floor was visible in the background. Eleanor was holding court, recounting an embellished version of the incident for a fresh group of arrivals. Alani's voice remained perfectly level, but it was now laced with something as cold and sharp as surgical steel. Cancel everything, David. Every last contract. David's voice registered a note of professional confusion. I'm sorry, Ms. Washington, could you repeat that? Cancel what, specifically? The entire $2.5 billion merger, Alani stated, her eyes sweeping across the laughing faces in the room. The real estate partnerships, the technology licensing deals, the supply chain agreements, terminate all of it. There was a stunned pause on the other end of the line. Ms. Washington, are you absolutely certain? The entire Vancroft deal? Alani looked at the faces of the people who had spent the evening trying to tear her down, to reduce her to nothing, and her voice dropped to a whisper that carried more power than any scream. Burn it all to the ground, David, and send me the confirmation. A few of the guests standing nearest to her had finally stopped laughing. Something in her tone, the quiet authority, the mention of words like billion and merger, had finally pierced through their arrogant bubble. They were starting to listen. They were starting to look at her differently. But Eleanor Vancroft was still completely, blissfully ignorant. She was by the bar, regaling a circle of sycophants with her witty take on the evening's drama. Look at her over there, still pretending to be important, Eleanor scoffed, gesturing toward Alani with her champagne flute. She's probably calling her parole officer. The group around her erupted in a fresh wave of laughter, but it was a little more strained now. A seed of unease had been planted. Harrison Vancroft had been in mid-conversation with a potential investor when the words billion and merger drifted across the room like phantom alarm bells. His face, already flushed from alcohol and self-importance, went chalky white. The color drained from his cheeks so rapidly the man he was talking to paused and asked, Harrison, are you feeling all right? Ignoring the question, Harrison pushed through the crowd, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs with a panicked rhythm. When he was close enough to see Alani's face clearly, close enough to hear the chilling finality in her voice as she ended her call, he interrupted her, his own voice cracking with a desperation he couldn't conceal. Excuse me, what did you say your name was again? Alani ended her call with a decisive tap on the screen and turned to face the man who, just minutes before, had called her a walking disaster. When she spoke, her voice was the calm, professional, and utterly devastating sound of a guillotine blade dropping. Alani Washington, founder and CEO of Apex Stratos. She reached into her small clutch purse and retrieved a single business card. It was made of black, anodized metal, her name and title etched in platinum. It cost more to produce than most people's weekly grocery budget. She handed it to Harrison with the same cool dignity she would afford a visiting head of state. Harrison took the card with a trembling hand. He read the name. He read the title. As the reality of those words detonated in his mind, his wine glass slipped from his other hand and shattered on the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot, echoing the shattering of his entire world. The sharp crack of breaking glass silenced the room instantly. Every head turned. Everyone stared at Harrison Van Croft, their host, now pale as a corpse and trembling. Eleanor saw the commotion and hurried over, still utterly clueless. "Harrison, darling, what is it? Why do you look like you've just seen a ghost? It's just the cleaning woman." Harrison was speechless. He could only stare at the metal card in his hand, reading it over and over as if sheer willpower could change the words. Eleanor, annoyed by his bizarre behavior, snatched the card from his fingers. "What on earth is this nonsense?" As she read the platinum-etched text, her own face underwent a horrific transformation. The haughty condescension dissolved, replaced by a wave of nauseating disbelief. The blood drained from her face. Her perfectly painted mouth fell open. Her hand began to shake uncontrollably. This can't be real," she breathed, the words barely audible. Harrison finally found his voice, but it was a ragged, strangled whisper. She's the Washington, our merger. She's Apex Stratus." The words hung in the supernaturally quiet air like a death sentence. The realization spread through the room like a virus, passed from person to person through wide eyes and gaping mouths. The laughter died. The phones stopped recording. The entire glittering assembly of Chicago's elite finally, catastrophically understood. Alani looked around at the gallery of faces that had been mocking her just moments before. Faces that were now frozen in masks of pure, unadulterated horror. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the tomb-like silence of the room. "The merger that was going to save your secretly bankrupt company. The merger that was going to inject $2.5 billion into Van Croft Enterprises and keep you from losing every single thing your family has built over the last century." She paused, letting the full weight of it land. That Washington. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a snowflake land on the terrace. Every single person in that penthouse suddenly grasped the same horrifying truth. They hadn't just been rude to a stranger. They had witnessed and actively participated in the complete financial suicide of the Van Croft dynasty. Eleanor's champagne glass followed her husband's to the floor, shattering into a spray of crystal shards. Blair stopped posing for photos, her face a frozen mask of shock. Carter slowly lowered his phone, the cruel video he had filmed now feeling less like a funny clip and more like a suicide note. Harrison tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His mouth opened and closed, a fish gasping for air in a world that had suddenly lost all its oxygen. In that single crystalline moment of terror, they all realized. They had humiliated, degraded, and racially abused the one woman on planet Earth who held their entire world in her hands. And she had just decided to clench her fist. What would you do to a family like this if you were in Alani's shoes? Would you cancel the deal, or would you find it in your heart to forgive them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button, because the fallout from this moment is just getting started. What followed was not merely a business deal falling apart. It was the swift, systematic, and public annihilation of an entire legacy. And it happened in real time, in front of the very audience that had egged on the cruelty. Eleanor Van Croft, desperately clinging to the shredded remnants of her superiority, was the first to find her voice, a voice cracked with panic and denial. She pointed a trembling, diamond-encrusted finger at Alani. "This is impossible. You're a nobody. This is some kind of elaborate sick joke. There is no way that someone like you could be Alani Washington." The words, "someone like you," hung in the air, a final damning testament to her unrepentant bigotry. But Alani Washington was done being polite. She was done enduring. She pulled out her phone with the calm precision of a bomb disposal expert and dialed a number. The call was put on speaker, her voice ringing out with crystal clarity, each word a nail being hammered into the Van Croft family's coffin. "Patricia, it's Alani. Please execute the Van Croft cancellation protocols, all of them, effective immediately." The voice that replied from the phone was calm, professional, and ruthlessly efficient. The voice of a person who moved billions of dollars before her morning coffee. Understood, Ms. Washington. That includes the real estate leasebacks, the technology partnerships, and the outstanding charity pledges? Everything, Patricia, Alani replied, her gaze fixed on the crumbling faces of the Van Croft family. I want every contract, every agreement, every partnership, every handshake deal completely and irrevocably severed. I want you to make sure there is nothing left connecting the name Apex Stratus to the name Van Croft. She ended the call and addressed the room of statues, the collection of shocked faces that had become her unwilling audience. Since you have all been so very curious about who I am tonight, she said, her voice level but carrying the immense weight of her power, allow me to introduce myself properly. I am worth $62 billion. The number landed like a physical blow. There were audible gasps. A few people physically took a step backward, as if the figure itself had a gravitational pull. Some of the guests who had been recording her humiliation just minutes earlier were now frantically, clumsily trying to delete the videos from their phones, realizing with dawning horror that they had meticulously documented their own social and professional suicide. I own this building you are standing in, Alani continued, her gaze sweeping across the opulent penthouse she had purchased 3 years ago through a shell corporation for tax purposes. I own half the office buildings where you run your companies. I own the banks that hold your mortgages. And I own the investment funds that manage your children's trust funds. She let that sink in, a chilling silence descending as people in the room began making terrifying mental connections. Some of you work for me and don't even know it. Most of you depend on my companies for your continued prosperity. And all of you just took part in the racial humiliation of your own bottom line. Harrison Van Croft finally spoke, his voice a broken, desperate plea. Please, Miss Washington, we didn't know who you were. If we had just known your position, your importance. Alani cut him off with a look so cold it could have flash-frozen hell. You knew I was a human being, Harrison. That should have been enough. The words landed with the force of a final judgment. Every person in that room understood. They didn't need to know her net worth to offer her basic human dignity. They didn't need to see her corporate title to refrain from calling her wretched. They had made a choice to be cruel based on nothing more than the color of her skin. And now, the bill for that choice had come due. Within minutes, a new group of people began arriving at the penthouse, and the atmosphere shifted from a social disaster to a corporate execution. Alani's legal team, summoned from their homes, began to walk through the doors. They were a squad of 12 men and women in impeccably tailored suits, carrying briefcases, their faces grim and professional. They fanned out across the room with the practiced efficiency of a SWAT team, pulling out contracts, legal notices, and termination papers. The lead attorney, a formidable African-American woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing, began reading from a prepared document in a clear, resonant voice that reached every corner of the ballroom. By order of the board of Apex Stratus, the following contracts and agreements are hereby canceled, effective immediately for cause. She paused, consulting her notes. The Van Croft Enterprises merger, valued at $2.5 billion. The Chicago Metropolitan Real Estate lease agreements for all Van Croft commercial properties. All technology partnership deals, valued at approximately $600 million annually. All global supply chain contracts, and all sponsorships for the Van Croft Family Charitable Foundation. With every item she read, another piece of Harrison Van Croft seemed to die. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. His breathing grew shallow. He looked like a ghost watching his own autopsy, but the attorney wasn't finished. Furthermore, Apex Stratus is calling in all outstanding loans and lines of credit previously extended to Van Croft Enterprises and its subsidiaries, demanding immediate and full repayment. As of this moment, all assets are frozen pending litigation. That was the final blow. Harrison swayed on his feet, and it looked for a moment like he would collapse entirely. The other guests now understood. This wasn't a canceled deal. This was a hostile, surgical dismantling of an entire empire happening right before their eyes. The panic began to spread like a contagion. A Mrs. Davies, who had laughed the loudest when Alani fell, suddenly went pale, remembering that her husband's logistics company was a primary contractor for an Apex Stratos subsidiary. She began to slip towards the exit, desperate to escape before she was recognized. A Mr. Peterson, whose hedge fund managed a sizable portion of the Apex pension fund, was now frantically texting his partners, trying to perform damage control for his catastrophic error in judgment of being present. The rats were abandoning the sinking ship. Major donors who had been flattering the Van Crofts all evening suddenly couldn't recall their names. Business partners who had been planning future deals now melted into the shadows and out the door. The penthouse began to empty with astonishing speed as person after person fled the disaster they had helped create. But the damage was already viral. Guests who had live-streamed the humiliation now found their videos being screen captured and shared with a very different context. The hashtags were already exploding on Twitter. Van Croft racism, billion-dollar bigotry, the cost of cruelty. Blair, who had orchestrated Alani's fall with such glee, was now sobbing in a corner, her perfect makeup running down her face in black streaks. "Daddy, what's happening?" she wailed, clutching at his arm. "Why is everyone leaving? What does this mean for us?" Harrison looked at his daughter, the princess he had spoiled and protected her entire life, with eyes that were hollowed out by despair. "We're finished, sweetie," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "That merger, it wasn't just a deal, it was our lifeline. Without it, we lose everything. The company, this house, the cars, all of it." The words didn't compute for Blair. In her world, consequences were for other people. "But we're the Van Crofts," she protested, as if the name itself was a magic shield. "We're rich! This can't be happening!" It was happening, in real time, because of a choice she had made. Carter, who had so proudly recorded Alani's humiliation, was now desperately trying to delete the evidence from his phone. But it was far too late. The video was already everywhere. His sneering, laughing face was already becoming the symbol of entitled, racist arrogance. Eleanor, who had been frozen in stunned silence, suddenly snapped back to life with a shriek. She rushed toward Alani, a wild, cornered look in her eyes. "You can't do this! You can't destroy our entire family over a simple misunderstanding!" she screamed. "One bad night. It can't erase a century of work. We made a mistake, but the punishment, it doesn't fit the crime." Alani looked at the hysterical woman, her expression unreadable. "This wasn't a misunderstanding, Eleanor. This was your character on display." She began to tick off the offenses on her fingers. "You called me worthless. You told me I didn't deserve to breathe the same air as you. You denied me a glass of water. You delighted in my humiliation. You judged me based on the color of my skin and nothing else." She paused. "You didn't just insult me, Eleanor. You showed me exactly who you are when you believe someone has no power to affect your life. You revealed your true self when you thought there would be no consequences." Her voice dropped. "Well, now you know who I am. And these are the consequences." In that moment, Carter, still drunk, still profoundly stupid, made a final catastrophic error. He stumbled forward, pointing a shaky finger at Alani. This is reverse racism," he shouted, swaying on his feet. "You're just doing this to us because we're white. It's illegal. We're going to sue you for every penny you have." The room, if possible, grew even quieter. It was the silence of people watching a man douse himself in gasoline and light a match. Alani turned to look at Carter with an expression that was almost pitying. "This isn't racism, Carter. This is the bill coming due. Learn the difference." She then pulled out her phone one last time and made one final call, on speakerphone. "Patricia, I have one final directive. I want the entire $2.5 billion from the terminated Van Croft deal to be immediately redirected. Establish the Grandma Rose Fund for underrepresented founders. I want every single penny of it used to fund businesses started by Black women, Latino entrepreneurs, and other minority innovators right here in Chicago." Carter's face went from flushed red to corpse white as he finally understood the magnitude of what he had done. "And Patricia," Alani added. Draft a press release for national distribution by morning. I want the world to know exactly why Apex Stratus is making this investment. I want them to know we stand against racism in all its forms, and that sometimes doing the right thing requires you to divest from the wrong people. At that, Harrison Van Croft's pride finally shattered. The great patriarch fell to his knees on the cold marble floor. Please, he begged, tears streaming down his face. Miss Washington, please have mercy. My children, my wife, they'll have nothing. My family's legacy, 5 generations, it will all be gone. They didn't understand what they were doing. Alani looked down at the broken man who had ordered her removed like garbage. They understood perfectly, Harrison. They understood that in their eyes, I was less than them. They understood that they could humiliate another human being for sport and face no consequences. They understood that my dignity meant nothing. She paused, her voice turning to ice. So, you are correct. They will have what they gave me tonight. Nothing. Eleanor finally collapsed into a nearby chair, the fight gone from her, the full, crushing weight of their ruin settling upon her. We're destroyed, she whispered to the empty room, completely and utterly destroyed. The few remaining guests stared, their phones now openly recording the final pathetic collapse of a dynasty. The Van Croft name was already becoming a global synonym for the most expensive act of bigotry in modern history. Alani gathered her wine-stained dress, preparing to leave the penthouse that was now hers in every sense of the word. She paused at the threshold, turning to deliver her final verdict on the family who had thought they were better than her. No, Eleanor, you aren't destroyed. You are simply no longer standing on the backs of others to see the view. She took one last look at their shattered faces. Some people price themselves out of prosperity. Consider this your final receipt. The silence she left behind was total. No one moved. Oh, no one spoke. They just watched as Alani Washington walked out of their lives, taking their past, their present, and their future with her. The aftermath was not just swift and brutal. It was a public vivisection. Within 24 hours, the story was the lead item on every news outlet in the world. Billionaire CEO cancels 2.5B, merger after vicious racial abuse. The bigotry that bankrupted a dynasty. How one family's hate cost them everything. A year later, the Van Croft name was a ghost. The estate auction was a media circus. Historic Chicago penthouse sold to pay racist families' debts. The penthouse on the Gold Coast was sold for a fraction of its worth to a consortium of minority-owned businesses that had been funded by Alani's new Grandma Rose Fund. The family's priceless art collection was sold off piece by piece to museums. Eleanor's jewelry, the very diamonds she had worn while she screamed insults at Alani, was auctioned to create a scholarship program for underprivileged students. Harrison Van Croft, at 66, was forced into personal bankruptcy. He got a job as an entry-level property manager in a distant, gritty suburb, commuting for 2 hours each way on the L train, an anonymous, gray-faced man in a sea of them. His new annual salary was less than what he once spent at his country club in a single month. Eleanor, once the queen of Chicago society, was a pariah. Charity boards she had chaired now refused her calls. The friends who had once clamored for her invitations now crossed the street to avoid her. She found work, for the first time in her 62 years, as a retail associate in a luxury boutique, folding sweaters and forcing a smile for women she used to consider beneath her notice. Blair, at 28, got her first real job as a barista, her hands, once soft and manicured, now perpetually chapped and smelling of burnt coffee. Her social media was a toxic wasteland of abuse. Dating was impossible. Every time someone Googled her name, the viral video of her gleefully tripping a woman appeared. Carter faced the bleakest reality. His unhinged reverse racism rant became a legendary internet meme. No reputable company would ever hire him. His trust fund was gone, seized by creditors. At 30, he was living in a bleak studio apartment, working as a janitor on the night shift. His job was cleaning the offices in a gleaming new tech incubator downtown. A tech incubator built and owned by Apex Stratus and funded by the Grandma Rose Fund, created with the money that was supposed to have been his. The family that had once thought they owned Chicago was now scattered, broken, and invisible. They had learned the hardest lesson in the world, that cruelty is a luxury no one can afford. They had traded their entire legacy for a few fleeting moments of feeling powerful by making someone else feel small. They had discovered that when you judge people by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character, you don't just lose your soul, you lose everything else. 2. The woman they had called Nothing had shown them what nothing truly was. They would spend the rest of their days haunted by the memory of the snowy night when they chose hatred over humanity and found out, to their eternal ruin, that a person's dignity can have a price tag. And that price tag, it turned out, was worth exactly $2.5 billion. The Whitmore name, once a symbol of power, was now a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and taught in business schools. A permanent reminder that character is a currency, and respect is the only investment that always pays dividends. Those who fail to understand that do so at their own peril. If you were inspired by this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Let's spread the idea that the best revenge is not just success, but building a better, more equitable world on the ashes of intolerance. We'll see you in the next video.